All right, so we're at the Fort Sumter Visitor Center, and over to my left here is where you buy the ferry tickets. So you have to take a ferry ride out there. It's about a 30-minute ride, and then you get an hour in Fort Sumter, and then of course about a 30-minute trip back. So you're looking at about 2 hours total. So let's go check it out.
Welcome you to Fort Sumter National Historic Park. We're going to start your afternoon off with a 35-minute boat ride. We'll be traveling a little over 3 miles through Charleston Harbor on our way out to Fort Sumter, where you will start your self-guided tour. You will be at the fort for 1 hour, and there is a lot for you to see. You will be able to find fingerprints in the bricks left by the enslaved people that made
This way, bud. The story of Fort Sumter begins long before the Civil War. Following the War of 1812, the United States government recognized the need to strengthen coastal defenses. American leaders feared future attacks by foreign powers and began constructing a series of forts along the nation's coastline. Fort Sumter was one of these projects. Construction began in 1829 on an artificial island built from thousands of tons of granite transported from New England. Named after Thomas Sumter, a hero of the American Revolution known as the Gamecock, the fort was designed to protect Charleston Harbor, one of the South's most important ports. The massive structure featured 5-foot-thick brick walls and was intended to mount more than 130 cannons. However, construction progress was slow, and by 1860, the fort was still not fully completed. Despite this, it remained one of the strongest military positions in the harbor. Everything changed in the presidential election of 1860. The victory of Abraham Lincoln alarmed many southern states, which feared the growing influence of the federal government and threats to slavery. South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. At the time, a small force of United States soldiers under the command of Robert Anderson was stationed in Charleston Harbor. Recognizing that his position at Fort Moultrie on the shoreline was vulnerable, Anderson made a bold decision. On the night of December 26, 1860, he secretly moved his troops across the harbor to the stronger and more defensible Fort Sumter. South Carolina leaders were outraged. They viewed the fort as belonging to their state, while the federal government maintained that it remained United States property. The standoff quickly became a symbol of the growing conflict between North and South. Over the next several months, tensions escalated. Confederate forces occupied other federal installations around Charleston Harbor and began surrounding Fort Sumter. Supplies inside the fort grew increasingly scarce as Anderson and his men waited for instructions from Washington. Meanwhile, the newly formed Confederate States of America established its capital in Montgomery, Alabama. Confederate leaders viewed the continued federal presence at Fort Sumter as a challenge to their authority. In April 1861, the crisis reached its breaking point. President Lincoln informed South Carolina authorities that a supply expedition would attempt to deliver food to the garrison. Confederate leaders feared that allowing supplies into the fort would strengthen federal control. On April 11th, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. Anderson refused. Before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries surrounding Charleston Harbor opened fire. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, a mortar shell made its way through the darkness and exploded above Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had just begun. For the next 34 hours, Confederate artillery pounded the fort from multiple directions. Shells and cannonballs were fired during the bombardment, and Anderson's soldiers returned fire, but they were at a disadvantage. Their ammunition was limited, and many of the fort's strongest guns could not be effectively used. Finally, on April 13th, Anderson agreed to surrender. Remarkably, no soldiers on either side were killed during the bombardment itself. The only fatalities occurred afterward during a ceremonial salute connected to the evacuation. Although the battle was small by later Civil War standards, its impact was enormous. News of the attack spread rapidly throughout the country. In response, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Several additional Southern states then chose to secede and join the Confederacy. What had been a political crisis became a full-scale war. For the Confederacy, the capture of Fort Sumter was an early victory and a powerful symbol of independence. For the Union, it became a rallying cry to preserve the nation. The fort's role in the war did not end there. As Union forces sought to regain control of southern ports, Charleston became a major target. Beginning in 1863, Union artillery and naval forces launched extensive bombardments against Fort Sumter. For nearly 2 years, the fort endured some of the heaviest shelling of the war. Thousands of projectiles smashed into walls, reducing much of the structure to rubble. Yet Confederate defenders continued to occupy the position despite the destruction. By the final months of the war, Charleston's strategic importance had declined. In February 1865, as Union forces advanced through South Carolina, Confederate troops evacuated the city and abandoned Fort Sumter. Soon afterward, the United States flag was raised over the fort once again. In a symbolic moment, Major Robert Anderson returned to Charleston to witness the restoration of the same flag that had been lowered after his surrender 4 years earlier. Today, Fort Sumter stands as one of America's most important historic sites. Managed by the National Park Service, it welcomes visitors from around the world who come to learn about the events that led to the Civil War and the battle that started it.